18. The perfect spy. Little joy have I to breathe this news, yet what I say is true. Shakespeare, King Richard II, 3.4, 85 to 86. The Cold War began in Iran, and the fall of the Shah was the beginning of its end. The Shah was, amongst other things, both a victim of the Cold War and one of its most fervent advocates. When historians try to tally the cost and benefits, the victors and the vanquished of the Cold War, they might well conclude that the fall of the Shah and the rise of radical Islam, and with it the tectonic shifts in the political landscape of the Middle East, were some of the most profound unintended consequences of the Cold War. Long before the CIA tried to use Islam and Islamists to fight the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, the Shah and Sabak had been trying to use religion to contain and combat communism. The CIA and the Shah both seemed initially to have succeeded in their efforts, but the price of the miscalculation in Iran was the throne itself, while in Afghanistan the result was the tragic domino effect of terror and the terrorist attacks on September 11th, 2001. Compounding this strategic miscalculation was the false sense of security the Shah felt after the violent suppression of the pro-Khomeini riots in June 1963. Asadollah Alam had been the prime minister in those turbulent times, and in later years, when he was the court minister, with more daily access to the Shah than anybody else had, he often whispered in the Shah's ear that the clergy were no longer a relevant political force in Iran. The mullahs, Alam declared with self-serving bravura, were politically destroyed, ideologically disarmed, and socially marginalized, and no longer constituted a viable threat. Even in exile, a few months after the Islamic Revolution in Iran, the Shah still believed that it was in fact the communist who had masterminded his fall. All through his political life, the Shah was preoccupied with fear of the Soviet menace. Even the coup of 1921, the first step in his father's meteoric rise in politics, was, according to the Shah, more than anything else an attempt to abort an imminent Bolshevik revolution in Tehran. 2,500 kilometers of common border with the Soviet Union and the relentless history of Russian expansionist mischief in Iran, rooted in the alleged Peter the Great's last will, exhorting his progeny to capture Iran and thus find access to the warm waters of the Persian Gulf and beyond, were the historical backdrop of the Shah's fear of the Soviet Union. This apprehension was exasperated by the Manichaean view of the world promulgated by theorists of the Cold War on both sides of the Iron Curtain. But by 1975, Iran's relations with its giant communist neighbor to the north were the best they had ever been. The only years that were, in this sense, comparable to the 70s were the first few years of Reza Shah's rule, when, thanks to court minister Teymourtash's friendly attitude toward the Russians, the Soviet Union accounted for close to 40% of Iran's foreign trade. By 1972, the USSR had emerged as Iran's third largest arms supplier. The rise of trade with Russia began in 1966, when, in spite of some pressure from the United States, Iran signed a major economic agreement with the Soviet Union. In a July 7th, 1966 meeting with the Shah, when Armin Mayer, the American ambassador pointed out the dangers of flirting with the Soviet Union, the Shah said he did not need the United States to lecture him in inequities of dealing with the Soviets. He assumed Mayer that he had no illusions. He assured Mayer that he had no illusions about Soviet intentions, but that his aim was improving relations with Russia while not falling prey to their temptations. In the same meeting, the Shah warned that when he turns to Soviets, USG should not set in motion political movement in Iran. The ambassador answered that the very thought is ridiculous. A few days later, in another meeting on the same topic, the Shah rallied against those who were puppets of the United States and against taking orders from the Americans, declaring that he did not care to emulate them. Some of the Shah's brothers told Vice President Hubert Humphrey that the Shah would go through with the Russian deal unless President Johnson invited him to Washington, and told the Shah how much you love him. None of these pressures or inducements worked. The Shah went ahead with the deal, and by the mid-70s, more than 8,000 Soviet technicians were working in Iran. Their areas of expertise ranged from metallurgy and mining to agriculture and steel production. So heavy was the traffic of these experts in and out of Iran that the Moscow-Tehran train was usually booked several months in advance. Iranian industrialists had also begun exporting huge quantities of Iranian products to the Soviet Union. Everything from soap and shoes to cars and air conditioners was being exported to the vast Soviet Empire. But deep tensions rooted in ideological differences and bred from 50 years of distrust lurked beneath the surface solemnities of peaceful coexistence. As an intelligence estimate by the U.S. government at the time made clear, while pursuing their policy of reconciliation with the Shah during the 1960s and 1970s, the Soviets retained all of the various tools available for use against him. These include critical public and private statements, support for a clandestine radio station broadcasting in Iran, continuing ties to the Tudeh Communist Party, which has its own history of subversion in Iran, a continuing espionage network within Iran, implicit approval for the training of Iranian dissidents by other forces hostile to the Shah, the capacity to conduct cross-border infiltration and arms deliveries, support of anti-Shah movement, and of course, a military capability on the Iranian border. Of these tools of subversion, the KGB was for the Shah the most feared nemesis. Much to his consternation, in the early 1970s, he realized that some of the activities of Soviet spies had reached inside the royal household. There was, for example, the discovery that a member of the staff at the court had ties to Soviet agents. She was, according to Alam, quietly dismissed. More important was the case of the Saberi family. Around 1972, Savak's counter-espionage units put Rosh Hanak Saberi, an employee of Iran's foreign ministry, under surveillance. After she went to a meeting with a Romanian diplomat, who in fact worked for the KGB, she was arrested. Before long, she confessed to passing information to the Soviets and indicated that her brother, Abbas Saberi, had recruited her for the work. Ostensibly a rich and generous rug merchant in Paris, Saberi turned out to be a key KGB operative. Abbas Saberi himself had been early in his espionage career, part of what the KGB called the ideological recruits, believers in the cause of socialism who, like Kim Philby and his gang of Cambridge spies, offered their services to the bastion of revolution gratis, and out of a sense of ideological camaraderie, gradually most of these ideological recruits became simple spies for hire. Saberi and his wife owned a famous store in Paris where they specialized in expensive Persian rugs. The KGB had successfully diverted attention from the true nature of Saberi's activities by spreading the rumor that he was in fact an apostate who had stolen funds from the Tudeh Communist Party in Iran and escaped to France. Saberi and his wife lived a life of bourgeois affluence and comfort in France, a large apartment in Paris, and an expensive vacation home in one of the most exclusive suburbs of the city. From the early 1940s, the couple had been the patron saints of distressed Iranian exiles in Paris. Their apartment was also a veritable salon for émigré intellectuals and political activists. Even high-ranking officials of the Shah's regime, including Abdullah Entezam, Iran's ambassador to France for several years, and General Hassan Ali Alavakia, one of the founders of SAVAK, and from 1961 to 1967 the head of SAVAK operations in Europe, frequented the Saberi house. Two of the people closest to the Shah had also been one-time visitors to the Saberi residence and had borrowed money from Saberi. Both had been exiled to Paris during the Mossadegh era. The first was Princess Ashraf, who was staying at the Hotel de Crillon, the most expensive hotel in Paris at the time. Though she was about to purchase a late-model Cadillac, she nevertheless felt poor and strapped. She wrote letters to her family and to trusted officials at the court, asking for financial help. She also, according to General Alavakia, borrowed some money from Saberi in return for a handwritten promissory note. The note was never cashed in or publicly used against the princess. Saberi kept it apparently as a badge of honor. The other person who had benefited from Saberi's largesse was Hussein Fardast, the Shah's close friend and confidant. He too had been exiled to France during the Mossadegh era and was indeed in a desperate financial situation. He borrowed money from Saberi, and this debt adds a new layer of enigma to his already storied life. In 1954, not long after the Shah's return to power, he received a report from General Zahedi, then the Prime Minister, suggesting that Fardast might be working for a foreign intelligence agency. Ardashir Zahedi was the messenger and witnessed how the Shah grew visibly angry and threw away the report, saying in anger, "Can't they see me even have one friend?" No more reports were sent to the Shah about the matter, and soon Fardast continued to be one of the Shah's most trusted aides. After the 1979 revolution, allegations about Fardast's ties to intelligence agencies surfaced again. In 1953, he was in Paris contemplating a new career in medicine, and it was then that he borrowed money from Abbas Saberi. By the time SAVAK discovered Saberi's role in recruiting spies for the KGB, the French authorities had also raided his house and concluded that he had been one of the key KGB operatives in Europe. For the Shah, compounding the anxieties caused by the Saberi case was his suspicion that the Iraqi mole had penetrated the ranks of the Iranian army. He ordered SAVAK to look for the spy, By the early 70s, Iraq was developing closer ties with the Soviet Union, and the Shah's worst nightmare was about to become reality. Soviet actions in Iraq he confided to Kermit Kim Roosevelt, who was visiting Iran as a businessman on April 26, 1972, were part of Soviet aspirations in the Persian Gulf. As early as November 1971, Savak had informed the Shah and the United States that should the Soviets succeed in bringing about the coalition they had planned in Iraq between the Ba'ath Party, the Communist Party of Iraq, and the Iraqi Kurds, they could in effect give the country a status similar to that of Eastern Europe. The Soviets, for their part, went out of their way to convince the Shah that the Soviet rapprochement with Iraq is not aimed against Iran. They informed him that in spite of demands by Iraq, they had refused to protest Iran's seizure of islands in the Persian Gulf. But the Shah was neither convinced nor comforted. In a May 7, 1972 meeting with President Nixon and Henry Kissinger, the Shah reiterated his position that, as the Soviet Union had closer ties with Iraq, they might soon succeed in establishing a coalition of the Kurds and Ba'athists and the Iraqi communists. And as a result, the Kurdish problem, instead of being a thorn in the side, could become an asset to communists. And when Kissinger asked what the Shah thought should be done to divert this danger, the Shah said, Iran can help with the Kurds. Both the State Department and the CIA were inclined to continue to avoid involvement in Iraq. They were both worried that the Soviets would construe any help to the Kurds of Iraq as a move against them. On June 23, 1972, the National Security Council concluded that the major view in town is that the U.S. should stay out of direct support for the Kurds. But the Shah continued to insist on his own vision of dangers in Iraq, and eventually Nixon reluctantly agreed with him and with the idea of funneling funds to Kurdish insurgents in Iraq. Israel, too, came on board with little resistance. Of course, for the United States and Israel, support for Iraqi Kurds was nothing new. For example, unbeknownst to the Shah, as early as August 1969, U.S. agents had flown to the Kurdish regions of Iraq and given one of the Kurdish leaders, Mullah Mustafa Barzani, $14 million in aid. Moreover, Israel had had close ties to Iraqi Kurds for some time. Beginning on August 1, 1972, a covert tripartite operation by Iran, Israel, and the United States was launched to destabilize the increasingly belligerent and unabashedly pro-Soviet Iraqi government. The idea was to help Iraqi Kurds in their struggle against the Central Movement. The Shah initially agreed to contribute $30 million, which he soon boosted to $75 million per year to the project. It was in this period that the Shah's fear and frustration over Iraq led him to order Savak to organize a coup to topple the Ba'ath regime. Iran had had a Kurdish problem of its own in the late 1960s, spearheaded by Iranian Maoists inspired by the Chinese Revolution. That movement had been easily suppressed by the Shah's army. Nevertheless, the Shah knew well that an independent Kurdistan in Iraq was sure to become a magnet for Iranian Kurds. Kissinger, cognizant of the Shah's concerns, aware of Turkey's similar Kurdish angst, and keen on destabilizing the Ba'athist regime in Iraq, famously declared that the strategy of the covert operation by the triangle of the United States, Iran, and Israel was to help the Iraqi Kurds enough so that they would become a nuisance for the Ba'athist regime, but not so much that they would become an independent state. It is a revealing twist of fate that the man sometimes acting as the intermediary between the Iraqi Kurds and their outside supporters was none other than Ahmed Kalabi. The Shah was serious about carrying out this destabilizing policy. In 1973, when it became clear that Iraq's new offensive might strangle the Kurdish movement in the country, the Shah went so far as to order units of the Iranian army stationed in Kurdistan province of Iran to enter Iraq disguised as Kurdish fighters, or Peshmerga, that join the fight against the Ba'ath regime. The commanders of the Iranian forces were ordered to avoid at all costs the possibility of one of their soldiers falling into Iraqi hands. The Iraqis were not only the ones kept in the dark about the Iranian army's covert cross-border operations. Surprisingly, the army's deployment, the nature of its engagement, and reports of the clashes were strictly confidential and kept not only from the Iranian people, but from much of the cabinet and from all of the parliament, which ostensibly had the power of the purse. Iran's engagement in Oman, where Iranian special forces and the Air Force were used to suppress and turn back a communist insurgency, was similarly kept secret from the cabinet, the parliament, and the people of Iran. Even today, 4 decades after those fateful years, there is little reliable detail and documentation about Iran's foray into playing the role of a gendarme of the region. But in those days, the Shah's will was the law of the land, and no one in the government dared question him about the legality or the wisdom of these decisions, or about the size of the Iranian military budget. Every year, one lump sum that included the military, the intelligence agencies, and all the auxiliary expenses was rushed through the parliament. The Prime Minister's multi-million-dollar secret discretionary fund was one of the camouflage funds through which some of these incidental costs were defrayed. In the meantime, the Iranian army was engaged in its covert activities in Iraq. The tensions between Iran and Iraq over a variety of issues, from navigation rights over the river that separates the two countries to the fate of thousands of Iranian Shiites who had been living in Iraq, were on the rise. More than once, Iraq had forced thousands of these Iranians living in Iraq to leave the country, leaving their homes and wealth behind. Iraq offered safe haven and facilities to a whole range of Iranian opposition groups. Radio Iraq was managed by some of these opponents and was increasingly acerbic in its criticism of the Shah. As willing as the Shah was to lead the effort to help the Iraqi Kurds, he was no less willing to suddenly end his support when in 1975 he surprised much of the world by signing an agreement with the Iraqi government. Even the American government was taken back when, shortly before the agreement, the Shah decided to inform them of his impending decision. According to an assessment by the U.S. Embassy, there were at least 5 reasons why the Shah decided to reach an accord with Iraq. In their view, Iraqi concessions of the Thalweg principle, probability of Kurdish defeat in absence of increased Iranian assistance, threat to Iran's OPEC leadership, international internal problems and internal problems and government of Iran's perception of change in the Middle East contributed to the Shah's decision. According to the CIA, the accord between the Shah and Saddam Hussein was signed in Algiers in 1975 had a secret codicil that stipulated that Iran must end its support of Iraqi Kurds and close its borders to fleeing Kurdish activists. While some Kurdish leaders, like Barzani and his family, were flown first to Tehran and then to the United States, the rest of the movement were left at the mercy of Saddam. At the same time, even Tehran Savak was looking for the Iraqi mole, and in the process learned a surprising piece of intelligence from its own mole in the Soviet embassy. Yeah, the word is embassy. Sambarambach. The mole was a man called Aliyov, and he worked in the Soviet embassy as a cultural attaché. He reported that KGB agents in Iran had been regularly meeting someone in the Iranian army on Naft Oil Avenue in Tehran. When Savak finally established the identity of the spy in Oil Avenue, it scored its biggest coup against Soviet espionage in post-war Iran. At the same time, the mystery of the Iraqi mole that had been of concern to the Shah was solved. The case also underscores the extent of the Shah's involvement with Savak's sensitive counter-espionage operation. In the effort to find Iraqi mole and the Soviet spy, the Shah was not only informed at every step, but was the one who made all the crucial decisions. Just want to back up slightly here and mention that there is a footnote after this particular sentence. According to an assessment by the U.S. Embassy, there were at least 5 reasons why the Shah decided to reach an accord with Iraq. In their view, Iraqi concessions of the Thalweg principle, probably of Kurdish defeat in absence of increased Iranian assistance, threat to Iran's OPEC leadership, internal problems, and government of Iran's perception of change in the Middle East contributed to the Shah's decision. Right after the words Thalweg principle, there's a footnote. One of the main precipitating causes of tension between Iran and Iraq was the sudden claim by the new Ba'ath regime that Shatt al-Arab, the river that has long been part of the border between the two countries, was an Iraqi waterway. Iran refused to accept the claim, and the Shah ordered Iranian ships to travel up the river, flying Iranian flags. Fighter planes from the Iranian Air Force provided cover for these ships. The Thalweg line is the standard internationally accepted way to demarcate the middle of the navigable channel in waterways that are shared by states. The Thalweg line is the standard international accepted way to demarcate the middle of the navigable channel in waterways that are shared by states. End of footnote. With the hint they had received from their embassy mole in 1975, Savak checked the identity of every household on Oil Avenue and its neighboring streets. It turned out that 3 Army officers lived in the area. All 3 were put under 24-hour surveillance. Their phones were tapped. A lieutenant colonel was the first who came under suspicion. He was arrested, and after some rough interrogation, Savak authorities were convinced that he was not the spy they sought. After a while, Savak agents assigned to the case saw a man with a dog pass by a known KGB agent who worked at the Soviet embassy. Neither man slowed their pace, and they discreetly exchanged a small envelope. It did not take long to figure out that the man with the dog was General Ahmad Moghrabi. The Shah was immediately informed of this surprising development and was asked for permission to arrest the general. The army had its own intelligence and counter-espionage division, and Savak asked the Shah to decide whether the army unit should be brought into the investigation. The Shah's response was categorical and characteristic of his style of managing the military and intelligence forces. Keeping the military, Savak, the city police, and other security organizations in a state of constant competition and contention was part of his divide and rule strategy. In fact, by the late 1960s, when the regime was first faced with a rising tide of urban guerrilla activities, these tensions were bad enough that they hampered the ability of the government to fight the foes, leading to the creation of the Committee to Fight Terrorism that brought together all these different agencies under a unified command and immediately developed an infamous reputation. It was no surprise that in the Moghrabi case, the Shah did not want the army involved or even informed about the ongoing investigation. More importantly, he emphasized that he did not want Moghrabi arrested yet. Instead, he wanted him caught in the act, with no room for denial or guesswork. By then, the KGB had a new man in Iran. His name was Vladimir Kuzychkin, and his candid, albeit all long-winded memoir, Inside the KGB, provides a fascinating account of the workings of the much-feared Soviet embassy in Tehran. Embassies often reflect the societies they represent. In the mid-70s, the Soviet embassy in Iran, according to Kuzychkin, was a den of corruption and inertia. He describes an embassy gripped by a culture of gossip, backbiting, dangerous leaks of sensitive information, and petty jealousies. Amongst the staff, he says there was an air of permanent holiday. The embassy personnel despised the ambassador for having a mistress and for lining his pockets. In his turn, the ambassador was wary of rocking the boat lest he be recalled from his plum posting. In the consular office where Kuzychkin worked, 4 of the 5 alleged diplomats were in fact KGB agents. They were there not just to spy on Iranians, but to keep a close watch on the 8,000 Soviet citizens working in Iran. The 2 expansive compounds of the embassy were as much about espionage as about diplomacy. One was located in the center of the city, and the other in the Golhak, an affluent suburb of Tehran in the early part of the 20th century, and traditionally used as the embassy's summer residence. The intelligence heart of the embassy consisted of 2 rooms located on the 6th floor and forbidden to all except a handful of KGB agents. The rooms housed all the electronic equipment used for surveillance and eavesdropping. In one room, they intercepted and recorded the radio conversations of Savak's external surveillance teams and Iran's military counterintelligence. Mars was located in a separate room, intercepting encoded Iranian communications involving such targets as various ministries, the Savak headquarters, and the American embassy. While the KGB was busy eavesdropping on the Iranian government, Savak and the American and British intelligence agencies were no less busy eavesdropping on the Soviet Union and its embassy in Tehran, in the two suburbs of Naushahar and Babelsar, two small cities in Iran's northern province of Mazandaran. The U.S. government operated two highly classified and critical listening stations that monitored crucial parts of the Soviet Union where nuclear test facilities were located. Both U.S. stations had been built underground to avoid detection by Soviet satellites, and both were in areas designated as royal hunting grounds, and were thus safely off limits to the public. The British operated a series of stations of their own on the border, and they too actually acted independently of Savak. Iranians were not allowed to contact the personnel in these stations. Occasionally, a high-ranking British or American intelligence officer would meet with the Shah and brief him on what was going on. The Americans had also built in their own embassy in Tehran under a structure that was ostensibly a garage, a vast secure room for gathering and transmitting intelligence. Throughout his life, the Shah had an insatiable appetite for the secret world of espionage. He enjoyed his regular weekly meetings with the CIA and M16 station chiefs in Tehran, as well as the occasional briefings he received from managers of the espionage stations. In addition, when the sudden increase of oil revenues allowed the Shah to satisfy his every wish and whim, he was reported to purchase intelligence reports not just from foreign agencies, but also from private security companies. Along with the American and British efforts to spy on Soviet Union, Savak was busy monitoring the Soviet embassy in Tehran. In fact, Savak had purchased a four-story apartment building overlooking the entrance to the embassy. While the first floor was ostensibly a doctor's office, officers of the 8th Directorate in charge of anti-Soviet counterespionage used the top three floors to monitor the traffic in and out of the embassy. Savak agents also manned a kiosk that supposedly sold soft drinks located right across from the embassy entrance. At one time, the surveillance of the Soviet embassy in Tehran was so tight that embassy officials asked Moscow to retaliate against the Iranian embassy in Moscow. No sooner had Savak been investigating the KGB's army connection than they realized that every move of their surveillance team was clearly known to the Soviets. Kuzykin confirms the story of the KGB eavesdropping on the radio frequencies used by Savak. He also indicates that the Soviets knew from the outset that what was going on in the doctor's office. Eventually, using an elaborate scheme that employed a large number of cars that never used their radio transmitters, thus remain undetected by the Soviet agents. Savak learned how the Moghrabi system of espionage operated. They were baffled by what they discovered. Soviet agents would arrive in the vicinity of the general's house, park their car, wait a few moments, and then leave. On one occasion, the Soviet agent got out of the car carrying something like a briefcase, walked towards an empty lot nearby, waited for 3 or 4 minutes, then returned to his car and departed from the scene. The Savak agents, a safe distance away, watched every move. Around May 1977, Moghrabi left for a holiday in the United States, where he owned a house in the state of Arizona, and where his children went to school. Savak used his absence to search his house. What they found looked like tools of the spy trade, but were unlike anything they had seen before. The Shah was immediately informed about the potentially incriminating evidence found in Moharabi's house and was asked for permission to arrest the general when he returned home from his American holiday. Once again, the Shah demurred, insisting instead that Moharabi be caught in the commission of his espionage act. Mindful of Iran's important and improving relations with the Soviet Union, the Shah wanted an airtight case, but Moharabi and the KGB handlers had devised a complicated mode of operation, making it difficult for Savick to catch them in the act. Aside from going to work, the general left the house only to walk his dog. He made and received no suspicious phone calls, and he had no unusual visitors. The break finally came one night late in September 1977. Two agents of the KGB arrived on Oil Avenue. The first was Boris Kabanov, an amiable man much adored at the embassy, where he worked under the cover of a consular official. The second was his driver, Titkin. They had received a signal from the man, that code name for Moharabi, asking for a rendezvous in the normal place. Seconds after the arrival of the KGB car, Moharabi emerged from the house accompanied by his dog. Kabanov got out of the vehicle, and as he passed Moharabi, quickly handed him an envelope and immediately went back to the car. He had barely settled in his seat when his car was surrounded by agents of Savick. Kabanov brandished his diplomatic passport and refused to open the door. The agents, in constant communication with Savick headquarters, were ordered to break the window, force the two Russians out of the car, and arrest them. Meanwhile, another team of agents arrested Moharabi. He tried to resist and cried for help. His son and his orderly rushed out of the house to help, but their efforts were in vain. Moharabi was arrested with the incriminating envelope in his pocket. The KGB apparently never paid much for the intelligence they received. A few $100s was the common rate. Anything over 10,000 required the approval of the chairman of the KGB. Moharabi's last wage of sin was a mere 30,000 tumen, or about $4,500. According to Soviet archivist Vasily Metrukhin, though initially recruited on ideological grounds, Moharabi had by the early 1970s become an increasingly mercenary agent with a regular monthly stipend that was 200 rubles in 1972 and was increased for a good service to 500 convertible rubles of 1976. He was also at the time awarded the Order of the Red Banner. With his pay in his pocket, the most effective KGB spy in post-war Iran was arrested. His KGB handler and the driver were released the morning after the arrest to the custody of the Soviet embassy and were given 48 hours to leave Iran. Moments after the arrest, the Shah was informed about the case's closure through the head of Savick. He commended the 8th Division for their work. At the time of his arrest, Moharabi was in charge of strategic planning for the entire Iranian military. Every war plan, every new defense formation, every projected new base and airfield passed over his desk. The last piece of intelligence he conveyed to the Soviet handlers was about Iran's plan to build a new secret airstrip in the desert. The secret airstrip of his report might well have been the one used some 5 years later at the American Special Forces by the American Special Forces in their ill-fated attempt to rescue American hostages held in the embassy in Tehran. Upon his arrest, owing to the unusual nature of his case, Moharabi was not taken to a prison, but instead to a Savak safe house. In the first few hours of interrogation, he denied any guilt and claimed that he had been in contact with the agents on the assumption that they were Americans. Eventually, he confessed to his crimes and described the nature of his long relations with the Soviets. The mystery of his longevity turned out to be simple. From the beginning of his Soviet collaboration, he had stipulated that he would never meet any agents in the streets and that he only worked from his house. For this reason, the KGB had developed an elaborate system whereby Moharebi sent a signal to his handlers asking for a rendezvous. They would appear on his street at a designated hour. He in his house and the handler in his car would turn on their transmitters and receivers, what they called the close information link system, and in moments the transfer of intelligence was complete. The machines were so sophisticated that Savak's technical department was unable to figure out how they worked. Eventually, with the help of M16 in London and the CIA in Langley, the mystery of the machine was discovered. For the Soviets, the arrest of Moharebi was a major blow. They began a desperate search for the possible causes of the Moharebi debacle. One obvious reason, they thought, was that they had overused him in the last years. According to Kuzychkin, the Soviets had no other real agents in Iran, and as a result they overburdened Moharebi with too many requests, thus making him vulnerable. Before his arrest in 1977, he had met with the handlers no fewer than 25 times. In spite of the common perception of the KGB as an omnipotent powerhouse of intelligence in Iran, aside from the Moharebi, their feared network of spies consisted of an Afghan diplomat, Homayun Akram, codename Ram, and a Persian nickname Timur, who essentially milked the Soviets and passed them insignificant bits of information. The man, Moharebi, turned out to be the only source with any real information, not only about the army but also about the casket, the code name for the Shah's court, and barracks of Savak, and barracks or Savak. Even if we add this to the picture, the readiness of pro-Soviet communists to turn over intelligence, the KGB emerges as a much weaker than anyone imagined. Footnote: the KGB's capacity must not be confused with the Soviet Union's cultural influence in Iran at the time. For example, during much of the 1970s, the de facto day-to-day editor of Kayhan, the country's most popular daily, was Rahman Hatefi. He turned out to have been all along a leading member of the Tudeh party. A cursory look at the headlines for the paper during his tenure indicates a clear but subtle tilt towards the Soviets, in spite of strict censorship by Savak. Some have suggested that the Shah knowingly allowed the tilt in order to keep the West on the edge about the clear and present danger of the Soviet Union in Iran. End of footnote. Yet the Shah considered them politically omnipotent and saw their hand not only in every major political upheaval in the country but even in some of the most mundane details of life. Roughly 2 years later, when millions of people took to the streets, the Shah reiterated his belief in the KGB's omnipotence by telling the American ambassador that only the British, the CIA, and the KGB could manage such a massive demonstration in Iran. By then, the KGB, bereft of its master spy, was scraping the bottom of the barrel trying to activate a spy who had been inactive for more than 2 decades. He was a relative of Hoveyda, who was codenamed Zaman. He had been initially recruited as an ideological agent, but for much of the 60s, according to KGB sources, he had been too busy building a fortune. But in the mid-70s, Zaman took part in KGB active measures operations, passing disinformation prepared by the KGB for the Shah. A key part of his disinformation was telling the Shah that the CIA was planning to create disturbances in Tehran and other cities. As an avid advocate of conspiracy theories, the Shah was more than willing to accept this disinformation. Another example of disinformation, this time intended not for the Shah but for the purpose of affording the KGB an air of omnipotence, was their claim that they had influenced the Shah's choice of his third and last wife, Farah Diba. The future queen was unaware of the KGB interest in her, but she was part of a circle of communist students' friends. The KGB even claimed that one of her relatives was an agent of the Soviets. Even in exile, weeks before his death, the Shah reiterated the idea that the Iranian Revolution was in fact the work of international communism and the omnipotent KGB. In reality, however, beneath this image of omnipotence was, at least in Iran, the reality of a weak, often incompetent organization, and with the loss of General Mogherabi, they had lost their only ace in Iran. The loss of Mogherabi had another consequence that once again directly involved the Shah. There was a shake-up in the KGB residency in Tehran, and the man who was blamed for the debacle was forced into retirement. The new station chief had a sordid past in Iran. In 1959, eccentric Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, exhibiting his colorful impetuosity, had ordered the KGB to assassinate the Shah. The KGB had at that time sent an agent named Fedaykin to Iran to assassinate the Shah. He bought a Volkswagen for the job, filled it with explosives, and hired an illegal, but the KGB term referring to anyone who had been smuggled into the country and could come and go without any official trace, to detonate the car when the Shah was on his way to open a new session of the Majlis. But a mechanical malfunction saved the Shah. The illegal hired for the job pushed the button, but the detonator failed to operate. The Soviets, of course, blamed their hapless minion for not pushing the button hard enough. The same man who had made a mess of the assassination attempt was appointed the head of KGB offices in Iran on what turned out to be the eve of the Islamic Revolution.